There we go. Okay, so thank you guys for being here this morning, and thank you for joining Washington Alliance for Quality Recovery Residences for our conversation about RECAP in recovery housing. I'm Brianna Yoakum. I'm the accreditation coordinator for Walker. And I'm so pleased to have Jessica and David joining us today. David Best is a professor and a director for the Center of Addiction Recovery Research at Leeds Trinity University. He is also an honorary professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University and an honorary associate professor at Eastern Health Clinical School in Monash University in Melbourne. He is also president of the Recovery Outcomes Institute in Florida. He has published more than 230 peer-reviewed papers on substance use, offending, and recovery. He's authored and edited books and special issues and more than 70 book chapters and technical reports. So his primary area of work is around recovery, specifically in recovery capital, what we're going to be talking about today. And then along with David is Jessica Casteel. She's the Director of Operations of the Recovery Outcomes Institute. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to David.
Great. Thank you very much, Brianna. And thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. What we're going to do is really three things. I'm going to do a relatively quick overview and introduction of where the RECAP comes from and why we developed it in the first place. Then we're going to just run through a kind of case study example of how to complete the RECAP form. And then the third and final stage is we'll talk to you a little bit about the data we were presenting. We are both here in Richmond in Virginia for the National Alliance of Recovery Residences conference, where we've been presenting some of the data that we've found from Virginia, which is really encouraging, and I hope will give you some sense of what's possible with this system. So just to start, and then we're happy to throw open for any questions and comments and any feedback you've got or things you want from us. So just by way of brief introduction, the concept of recovery capital now is 25 years old. It has its origins in a sociological concept called social capital that was really about the idea that even if people don't have money, they can still have a whole range of resources and supports based on their networks, their sense of belonging, their sense of identity in the community. And for us, the definition of recovery capital is the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that are available to people to help them overcome addiction problems. And I think for me, one of the exciting things about this approach was recovery had been a contested term in medicine and science for a number of years. People said it's too personal, it's too individual, you can't count it. It's not, it's all about inside people's heads and their own experiences. And really the whole idea of recovery capital was it gave us a framework for quantifying and measuring where people were in their journeys. And the work that's happened in the course of the last 15 years has given recovery not only a kind of scientific base, but a systematic way of mapping where people are and what can be done to support them in those pathways and processes. And in about 2010, I did some work with an American academic from New York called Alexandra Lodi, where we started saying, well, it's all very well talking about recovery capital as if this was something new and innovative, but unless we can actually manage to count it, it's not particularly helpful. So we created a kind of pie chart where we said there's three bits to this. There's things that go on inside the person, which is their personal recovery capital. There's things that go on about people's social networks, their social capital, and there's things about where they recover and the context of recovery, which we can call collective or community recovery capital. And in essence, if you're serious about counting recovery, you have to be able to map and measure all three of them. And the following year, in 2011, we published our first attempt at measuring this. So in 2011, we published something called the Recovery Group Participation Scale, which was a 14-question questionnaire that attempted to assess what kind of recovery community capital did somebody have. Then the following year, we published something called the Assessment of Recovery Capital. And the Assessment of Recovery Capital was 50 questions, half of which measured personal resources and half of which measured social resources. And there's a couple of things worth saying about this. The first thing is that measuring recovery is different from measuring treatment things. We stop measuring what's wrong with people and what's going badly in their lives, to switch the focus to what's good, what strengths and resources they can draw upon. And the second big change is the assumption that recovery is not something that happens inside of people. It's something that happens between people. It's a fundamentally and intrinsically social process. And over the course of the last 15 years, I've collected something like 3,000 recovery stories in different locations. And the only common component of them is that nobody does it alone. There are always social factors underpinning people's recovery journeys. So we published that in 2012, the Assessment of Recovery Capital, and it gained quite a lot of traction among researchers. But there were two big problems with it. One was that it took too long. As a paper and pencil test, it took too long to get the results, and it was out of date afterwards. And secondly, nobody knew what to do with the results. So there was then a significant gap and delay while we thought about how to address some of those problems. And the partnership with the Florida Association of Recovery Residences started in about 2016. And we came up with the idea of saying we need to broaden our definition of recovery capital. And we need to think about ways of automating it so that as soon as somebody finishes the questionnaire, they get the results profile. And it's not just a number score. You actually can do something with it. And the model is measure, plan, engage. So the idea is you count where somebody's at. You then think about what the strengths they have and what needs they have. And you immediately create a recovery care plan. And to activate that recovery care plan, you engage with resources in the local community. So the model is measure, plan, and engage. And effectively, what we are going to show you is how that model works in practice. Effectively, what we want to do is to say that we'll just sort of run you through a case study of what happens when somebody goes through this questionnaire, this instrument in the online version. So firstly, can you see the screen we're sharing? Can you nod if you could? Yes, thank you for the nodding.
Yeah.
Yes, so you can see what we're seeing. Perfect. And hopefully you'll all realize that this is a fictitious character. Wile E. Coyote is not a real person, so we're not abusing anyone's privacy or confidentiality in doing this.
We're going to review a baseline assessment.
Yeah, so basically what we're going to do is we will go through the stages. So Wile E. Coyote is a 57-year-old man, and we have that basic level of demographics on the first page, and that's all we'd really fill in. And then we'd move forward from there to asking 5 questions about Wiley's health. And, you know, just to save time, we're not actually going to complete them all. This is a practice example. So we start with overall well-being indicators, each of which are out of 20. How good's your psychological health, physical health, quality of life, quality of accommodation, quality of your social support network, given a total score out of 100. And as soon as that's done, we then move on to something that we have learned in time that we have to do is we have to measure barriers to recovery. And we measure 5 barriers to recovery based on the assumption, while there is acute chaos in somebody's life, it's almost impossible to build strengths and resources. So those 5 barriers are accommodation, substance use, risk-taking, criminal justice involvement, and lack of meaningful activities. And essentially what we're trying to find out about accommodation is, does the person have debts around their housing? Are they at risk of eviction, or have they got serious housing problems? For substance use, we basically ask people about, have they used, has a substance ever been a problem? Have they used it in the last 90 days? And if they have, it will then come up with how many days have they used it in the last 90 days? And it gives us a mapping. You'll see the results down the right-hand side of Wiley's responses to this. Then we move on to risk-taking, and this is really about bloodborne virus associated with drug use. So we ask questions about sharing of injecting equipment and sharing of paraphernalia. The next section is about justice, and we ask, really the key questions are people involved in new levels of offending, or do they have new involvement with the criminal justice system? And the last of the barriers is a reversal. And what I mean by that is we ask, are you currently involved in full-time work, part-time work, education, or volunteering? If the answer to that is no to all of them, we would say the person has a significant problem because they have no meaningful activities in their life, and that's a risk to recovery. Continuing on the negative side of the ledger, if you like, we then ask about, are there unmet needs in the way of professional supports? And they are really about, are they involved with alcohol services, drug services, mental health services, housing support, employment services, primary health care, family relationships, or other kinds of support? Now, if they say, yes, they are involved, we ask, are they engaged? Yes, we ask, are you satisfied with your level of engagement? But the key question is the last one. Do you need any additional support in this area? And the total of answers to that is the total number of unmet needs they have. So there are two things on the negative side of ledger: the barriers people have and the unmet needs they have. We now switch to strengths, and the next two sections are the assessment of recovery capital. So each of them consists of 25 questions, and the idea is the person just ticks if they agree. No thinking, no reflecting. Does this apply as you feel at the moment? And we tick the boxes, and that gives us a total for each of those subscales out of 25. And each 25 consists of 5 subscales. And exactly the same is true for social recovery capital. 25 questions, tick if you agree with the item, and the scores will split into 5 subscales that we'll show you shortly, because as soon as we go through the questions, we will take you to what the answers look like. The third component, so we've asked about personal recovery capital, social recovery capital. We now ask about community recovery capital in the form of recovery group participation. 14 questions, and again, the same applies. Tick if you agree, leave it blank if you don't, and that gives you your total for recovery group involvement and recovery group participation. So you get a score out of 14 for that, but we also are interested in knowing, do you have additional needs around peer support and mutual aid group involvement? So that's at the bottom part of that. We then ask 4 quick questions about social support. Do you get the emotional support you need? Do you get the help you need? Do you get the resources you need? And do you get the advice you need from other people? So that's an added element of social recovery capital. And then the last of the scales we ask is the only motivation question, which is 5 items around how committed are you to sobriety, which is taken from a scale developed by Kelly and Green. So they are all established questions. And then basically we ask 4 open-ended questions. The idea being your recovery score should be, or where you go with your recovery should be a combination of our consensual agreed components and your own personal aims, aspirations, and perceptions of what we have. So this is the only bit of the questionnaire where you have to kind of fill in open text fields, really. We ask, you fill in these questions about where do you see yourself, what are your current life goals, what do you need to get to the next part in your journey, and who do you rely on for your recovery journey. Now, for the magic part. As soon as the person completes the last question and hits the submit button, this is what you will see. You effectively have 3 scores across the top. the total score in red of deficits of all the negative components, total score in green of all the strengths, the positive components, and then the sum of those two things. So for somebody who was doing completely terribly, had all of the deficits and barriers and no resources, their score would be -100. At the opposite end of the spectrum, somebody who had no barriers or deficit or unmet needs and had every single strength and resource, their total score would be +100. So the range of possible scores is -100 to +100. And you'll see Wiley is not doing well because his net score is negative, -15.9. We also use a traffic lighted system. So for each of the scales, and this is the 5 well-being indicators to start with, they basically, all of the scores are categorized as red, amber, or green. Red means it's a problem that needs to be addressed. Amber means you're doing okay in that area. Green is a strength you can deploy moving forward. And just on the subject of barriers, you can see that Wiley has 4 barriers and one area that's not a barrier at all to him. So there's a lot of negatives and problems with Wiley before he moves on. Similarly, in the next section, we list, and again, we color code what are the unmet needs, and the unmet needs are listed here in red. We now switch to the opposite side of the ledger, if you like, and the Manhattan skyline is effectively our quantification of what the strengths Wiley has. The first 5 are the personal recovery capital scores, which are coping, physical health, psychological health, recovery experience, and risk-taking, and the 5 social recovery capital subscales, which are community involvement, housing and support, meaningful activities, social support, and substance use and sobriety. Now, they are the total scores, but if you click on housing support, the area where Wiley is doing badly, you can drill down to the level of individual items. And what we have here is Wiley's first 4 completions on each of those questions. And in any of the subscales, we try and present it in a way that's accessible, but you can dig down to the next level if you want more detail or granularity in the responses. And on the right-hand side of that slide, the 3 donuts represent the other 3 strength areas: community capital, social support, and commitment to sobriety. And essentially what we have here is scores on those other 3 elements, and you can see that 1 is positive and 2 are neutral. So in terms of strengths, Wiley's actually not doing too badly. We've got only 1 area around housing that's a significant deficit, and there are 4 areas of strength: physical well-being, psychological well-being, recovery experience, and commitment to sobriety. And that essentially is the summary of the individual component parts of the RECCAP. But the other thing that's important to say is that the RECCAP is not just a measurement tool. It's a system for helping people build recovery capital. And the idea here is that you then use that, you would get that score profile, you would discuss it with the client and say, do they agree with that? Does this make sense? And one of the kind of taste tests, if you like, for us has been, whenever we do these training events, or whenever we get people to fill it in, we get them to fill it in on themselves and say, is this an accurate reflection? And I would say at least 9 times out of 10 people would say, yes, it is. That's where I am with this. So, it works in that sense. Now I'm going to hand over to Jessica to start answering some of the questions about what do you do once you've got that profile. So that's the score profile. And then we now move into the, how do you make sense of that score profile and what do you do with it moving forward?
So we begin to transition into our discovery map, which opens up the conversation between what we refer to as recovery navigator or peers and the individual members or clients that are involved in your program. So we take the same results, but we visualize it a little differently so we can have this conversation. And you can see at the very top of our discovery map that there are 5 trees, which represent the strengths inside of the RECCAP. So we have the personal capital tree, the social capital tree, community capital tree, commitment tree and quality of life tree as well. What we're looking to do is to grow healthy, strong green apples on each of these trees. It's the same visuals from the previous results screen, but now we can show we have a few trees and a few apples that we really need to focus on nurturing so that we can grow them, strong and healthy. In order to do that, we have to address the soil. The soil comes from all of the red areas that we need to start focusing on. These are all the barriers to recovery and unmet service needs that came out of the RECAP results based on how they responded inside of that questionnaire. So the recovery navigator and the client would be able to sit down and say, okay, now it looks like we have quite a few here that we're going to start with, but we really would just want to focus on the first few. If you were to choose the first 5 priorities and put them in a list for me, what is the most important thing we need to work on right now? How do we begin to focus on creating a goal to accomplish that thing? What resources are in the community that can help you address it? Because I'm a recovery house. I am not a level 4, so I have nothing to do with treatment whatsoever. I'm good. I know treatment programs in my area that I would trust to make this connection, and I can see that's a need. Is that something we need to hook you up with today? And we'll set a recovery goal around that and begin to track them. Whereas work, training, and volunteering, we might be able to help with that, just local resources, mutual aid groups, that kind of thing. So we begin to discuss how to address the soil here. And we move on to, once we have an initial agreement and plan, we pick those goals that we'd like to add to the recovery plan just to begin with. So we choose those, we'd be able to modify them. So if I was to come into, let's say, specialty treatment here, because he has this, impacted tooth and he doesn't have any dental care. And if he doesn't figure out how to fix this tooth or, address the pain that's being caused by this tooth, I know how Wiley's going to go fix the pain. And, we need to address this pretty quickly. So one of the goals is specialty treatment about going to the local health county and, our area. They'll take care of this for free. We know that you're going to get qualified. Let's set the appointment. I'll help you with that process. So we go through what are the steps that Wiley would need in order to go through specialty treatment or whatever this goal was. If we need to change any of these things, very easy. We'd be able to go in and just edit the actual tasks, add different resources and availability to each of those tasks to be able to tag them. We do have start dates and end dates because we do like to follow a very smart goal-oriented system. So we do make sure that they're measurable and that they are time related. And once we've added each of the goals that we're going to begin to work with, it leads us to our recovery plan where we can both just take a look at these are the first few goals that we are looking at to accomplish together. And we begin to monitor that process. So we help Wiley in beginning to address those goals, get connected with the resources in the community, use some of his internal strengths and resources that were identified as part of that process. And you can see here, these are all the external resources that he's ever used as part of this recovery plan, which has grown and grown and grown since he accomplished some of those tasks. We're able to add some more of those goals. We can also monitor any of the events that he was engaged in, anything that he planned to attend, anything that was actually held versus attendance, anything that was absent. And this could include anything from, as you can see, Wiley was, active in the Rat Pack Runners, which is just a recovery group that goes running together. To NA groups or to stepping into like community capital groups, to house meetings, for example. These are things that happen in between assessments that help me in my growth of recovery capital. So we begin to track that information. And Wiley is the only one that has the ability to rate those resources that we assigned. That way, both the program, the system itself, and other clients in the future don't need to use resources that were useless in accomplishing this goal as we begin to track this information. And so he's able to come in and say, you know what, this was a great resource, 5 stars, really thankful that the Palm Beach County Health Department exists. I tested negative when I went in to go for my bloodborne virus, test because there was an exchange of needles. And so I didn't need to use this one as a result of it because I'm negative. That is a relief off my shoulders. So he gets to share that information. And then the next phase of the system is ongoing progress review. So the navigator and the client can meet regularly to review where Wiley is in accomplishing those goals, whether or not we need to adjust any of those tasks prior to completing a new evaluation, whether or not he needs additional assistance, his level of engagement in that process. We also have node link maps that are built into the system as well. So do you want to talk a little bit about node link maps?
Yep, and the idea of node link mapping It's something that was developed at the Institute of Behavioral Research at Texas Christian University as a way of trying to make care planning a genuinely shared process and activity. And in my previous world as a clinician, we used them as a way of trying to improve communication. But for recovery, they are perfect. And essentially, the idea is the pen should change hands, or the keyboard should change several times, because what they do is they provide a structure and a clarity about making sense of how people move forward. So when people achieve things, we have what's called building on your success map that looks at, let's talk through what the generalizable learnings are from that. How do we build your self-esteem and self-efficacy based on your success? When there was an unsuccessful attempt, as is on the screen at the moment, the idea is to say, okay, let's review what went wrong. How did we not achieve the goal? Were we too ambitious? Did we do too much? And it just creates that self-reflection learning process, but crucially within a trusting relationship. The idea of this is the relationship is fundamental. Recovery relies on those fundamentally social processes. So we use the node link mapping as part of the process of saying, how do we do this? And this is just to put this in context, the idea here is it's a cyclical process. So you do the baseline and then you review on average around 90 days later at the 90-day point, and from then on, you will both look backwards and forwards. You review what somebody has done, and you'll see here what we have is some of those change metrics that we can look at. For Wiley, starts disastrously, and then we have some really good achievements, and we get this sense of moving forward over time. And for each of the dimensions, we can show what the growth and trajectory is of change on each of those scores. So change is crucial because the assumption, and we're delighted to say this is the case, the RECAP is sensitive enough to pick up changes. And sadly, recovery capital can go down as well as up. Something terrible happens, barriers go up, unmet needs go up, and strengths dissipate. So it's bi-directional. But the aim for this is to make sure that we both monitor that and then intervene accordingly to allow those changes to be understood and supported over time. So it's a gradual transition to stable recovery over roughly a 5-year period of time.
And we're very excited to bring Washington and all of you on board as part of this process too. I know that David talked in the very beginning about sharing some of the data that has come, the most recent data set that has come out of the Virginia model so far, since that's what we've been presenting on in Virginia at the NAR conference this year. We will be in the Michigan conference next year for 2023, and we'll be presenting about Michigan's data since they're on board as well, and be able to pull some of the information and show some of the highlights and successes that have happened, as a result of this too. One of the really neat things is walking around and engaging with each of the housing providers here and being able to learn a little bit about, their transition through this program from the day they started with this, overwhelming, this sounds great, this is fantastic, but it's more for me to do type of mentality, to I, am so happy that I did this. You have no idea, I don't know that you dug down into this yet, but we see now that it actually has affected our retention rates. So we now have people staying on average so much longer than they used to as a result of this process too. And we can correlate that with the growth recovery capital inside of their program. So it has been really fun to watch.
Do you want to stop screen?
Yes.
Sharing the screen now, then talk a little bit about what we're... So I'm just going to quickly review some of the data progress we made. So I'm going to start with some work we did in Florida about 2 or 3 years ago, where with one recovery residence provider, fellowship living, what we were able to show was that recovery capital grows and that we can predict what causes growth in recovery capital. I'll come back to that. But the first thing we did, which I think is crucially important from your point of view, was we were able to say, why do people drop out? So for us, for fellowship living in Florida, poor retention was associated with being younger, being female, having lower involvement in recovery groups, and having greater needs around housing. So it provides you with that kind of diagnostic, that kind of sense of who are the people who we need to think about additional supports for retention. For people who were retained, where we had multiple data collection points, we were able to show that entirely consistent with the recovery literature, the people who showed the greatest growth in recovery capital were people who were employed, who had better social support, who had better involvement in recovery groups, curiously who were younger and who had higher quality of life at the start of the process. So it allows us to start tracking that. And I guess we've now got 2 waves of Virginia data, and the Virginia data was crucial because the first one basically showed there are significant increases in recovery capital from coming into residences to around 3 months later, but then those gains are sustained. There's no drop off, and right up to about 3 years later, we still show continuous and relatively high levels of recovery capital. The most recent data we have is based on just under 2,700 clients, and they completed over 5,500 RECCAP forms. So what's the first take-home message? First take-home message is clients, navigators can and will do this. This is feasible and possible. Now, it takes people a while to get up to speed, so it's one of those things, don't expect it to be perfect to start with. It's a process, and you have to learn how to do it. The navigators have to learn how to, to some extent, so do the clients here. Your residents have to understand what's going on as part of this. And we basically were able to show that crucially, and this is big for Virginia, and we had lots of state representatives here for the presentation today, but from baseline to around 6 to 9 months later, there are significant increases in personal capital, social capital, recovery community group involvement, and crucially, the baseline score on the RECCAP goes from 26 to 48, nearly doubling the level of recovery capital. There were 2 other specific things we were able to report on. One was a prison program called Chesterfield Heart, where crucially the question was, can we build recovery capital as people transition from jail to recovery residences in the community? And again, we were able to show that there were significant improvements in barriers to recovery, unmet needs, and significant improvements. So over the course of their follow-ups, growth in personal recovery capital, growth in social recovery capital, a significant growth in recovery group participation, and almost a doubling in the score of the overall recovery capital index from 28 to 48. One of the things VAR also was able to get funded, partly because of this evidence-based model, was a more intensive support for some clients with greater needs at the outset. And for us, we were able to demonstrate that where high risk, high need clients get more intensive recovery capital support, they can close the gap on standard clients over the course of about 6 to 9 months. In other words, their recovery capital was much lower than typical, but their growth was much higher over the first 9 months. They improved significantly. Now, do those results apply to you? No, they don't. But what's important is from a funding mechanism and for, as Jessica said earlier, from an engagement process, what we were able to show was the system works. The measures are sensitive enough to pick up change, and we are able to demonstrate that growth over time in all of those key indicators. So from our point of view, I think today's process showed that, you know, the VAR were able to say people who go to recovery residences will show improvements in their well-being over time. It becomes a genuine evidence-based thing, and that the individual providers feel vindicated by this. Their services are showing this growth in recovery capital. All the stuff you know that your service does, we will demonstrate empirically and scientifically. But we will also be able to say, as we start to mine the data better and more, here is how you can improve. Here are the areas where you don't do well in recovery capital and where there are gaps and blips in your performance. And here are some of the things the data would suggest. This is proper evidence-based recovery practice. And I think on that kind of positive, I'll stop and we'll go back to Brianna to see any questions from you, Brianna, or do you want to throw the floor open to people? Jessica, anything else for you first?
No, I'm going to wait for questions.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I know a lot of our accredited providers who are kind of interested in this are on here. So I'd love to just open it, I mean, to anybody who has questions about it, but even specifically those who are kind of in the consideration phase of wanting to implement this in their recovery residences. Feel free to just unmute yourself if you want, or type something in the chat.
It's not necessarily a question, but I just want to say that this looks so incredible and it's going to be such a helpful tool moving forward. And you guys are doing an awesome job, and it's amazing how much that is going to not only help engagement, but funding resources and all sorts of, other cool things that help those of us that are in recovery.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. And yes, that is definitely our hope as well. So, and we're very happy that Washington and WACAR have come together to make this available to each of you for free, so we can bring this back to the state and show them this is what works and this is what we need.
And I think here in Virginia, Anthony Grimes, who's the VAR coordinator, would be quick to say he's been able to use that to go back to the state to get more money to based on the fact that we have demonstrated the effectiveness of not only of the RECCAP system, but of their model more generally. And, Sabrina, I think you're absolutely right. One of the problems has been we've always been weak in evidence in the recovery field. So we relied far too much on personal testimonials and stories. And this gives us hard, solid data that are very difficult for our states and funders to argue against.
Yeah, any other questions? Stephanie said agreed.
Hey guys, just a quick question about, I have a medical background myself, so I know I have done a fair amount of testing myself, even in medical university or just otherwise, and I know that a lot of people try to change the test outcome by not answering honestly. Do you guys have anything built in to the tests to see if people are being truthful, or they try to manipulate the outcome to get into certain programs or whatever they think it's favorable? Do you guys retest people at certain periodical times? When you provide this test, is it like there's confidentiality, or do you provide this to the housing providers, and do you provide training for the housing providers to correctly read the tests and not just jump to conclusions? Thanks.
Okay, so let me start with various components of that. No, we don't have any truth-lie questions hidden in there to try and detect if somebody's faking their answers. But it's a strengths-based test, so it's much less obvious if somebody is lying or faking results. Secondly, one of the things that we are attempting to predict is retention. So we have a clear kind of outcome measure that we can test all our indicators against. Thirdly, in at least one site, we're looking at external validating mechanisms. So we're looking at data linkage studies as a way of saying, can we corroborate and validate things like health, criminal justice involvement? And in terms of your specific question about how it's operationalized, so one of the places we piloted in is 2 therapeutic courts, one in Rhode Island, one in Boston. Well, obviously there people aren't necessarily going to admit to criminality because of the situation and context they're in and the potential ramifications of admitting to new offending behavior. So we have had to test that. But in terms of those questions about how do we manage that process of confidentiality, we've run this in a prison in the UK, and by far the most successful model was peer navigator delivery rather than either prison officer or professional drug and alcohol worker delivery. And partly I think that's because people are willing to be more open and honest in that context, and there's far less likelihood of faking. So, like any self-report indicator, can we absolutely guarantee honesty? No. And one of the things I think we might face occasionally is very early on, people being overly positive about how well they're doing in the first month or two of recovery. And then there's a little blip as reality hits. But in terms of, we are doing validation studies to test against various criteria to check on the science of the accuracy and predictiveness of our tests. So we haven't completely answered that, but we're in the process of doing so.
And I'll follow up with that one too, Mariana, and pick up. There is some training that we do with the peers around how to prepare the member to take the RECAP assessment. So the baseline is usually done with the peer. So sitting side by side, explaining what this is. This is for you. It is your journey. You're going to be able to take this, even if you leave my program, you can still log into this. This is yours to own. So it's your recovery journey, and go through some of those, principles initially, and to explain that. Then to sit down and be able to walk them through that RECAP assessment, and then to interpret the results and to start to go through that care planning. The goal is eventually to begin to step them down into the place where they're completing the assessments in their own portal prior to coming and sitting down with you as a peer to review those results and then update the care plan. Later on, it's to start to create their own goals and then walk through their thinking of creating those goals with you, rather than you helping them to create the goals and making sure that they agree. So it's beginning to prepare the individual to own their own recovery journey, and they can continue to take this, even if they leave your program, and use that for free for as long as they like. The very interesting thing that we also get to begin to drill down to in Virginia, as I'm sure many of you experience, is that you have members that leave your program, they just go MIA. So they will drop out of the program, or they abandon, or there is an issue, and they will house hop. They'll go to one of your other programs that are currently on this call, and you may not even know it. But the network can now begin to see that these individuals move throughout the network, and they'll take that recovery plan with them and their assessment as well. So if they go from, and I'm just going to call out a couple of names that I see on the screen, if they go from Sabrina's program to Stephen's program, they get to use the same RECAP evaluation, and they get to use the same recovery care plan goals. So they own their data, and it moves with them as members and clients as well. As far as training, yes, we do work with the individual programs for training. We also are releasing, very exciting to release, our learning management system as well. So directly inside of the system, you and your staff will be able to log in and complete the training on demand. And then we're going to go through lots of evaluation and evolution of that process too. I hope that now has answered all of those questions.
Yeah, and for Walker, we do have Michael Hardy, who's on here. He's our kind of navigator for helping onboarding our providers into getting those initial steps done and getting some trainings done for them to feel comfortable with it, along with Jessica as well, helping out. So yeah, any more questions? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
Nope, I was asking the same thing, Brianna.
Yeah, and we are offering it at Walker. We're offering it free for our providers. So if this is a tool that you guys are interested in, again, we're onboarding people at the moment.
The other part I would like to very quickly be able to address for those of you who've already started to use the registry system, I believe, in Washington with the Get Help team.
Mm-hmm.
The Get Help team are our technology partners. So our system is going to communicate with theirs. You won't need to duplicate your efforts. Your bed availability will be available directly from the ARMS system into that registry system as well. So ARMS isn't just the measure, plan, and engage components. It is also a resident management system. So you have everything from e-documents to bed management to drug testing logs to medication logs to the ability to accept payments and rent through your program. It is a full resident management system.
Yeah, and if any of our providers that are on here now that are not utilizing the full Get Help system, yeah, please reach out to me and we can get you set up with that as well.
I just wanted to make a comment. So we use Get Help currently, and we are getting started with the ARMS. And I just have to say, I'm really excited to get started with the ARMS, because with Get Help, it does a certain thing, and then ARMS does what Get Help doesn't, and vice versa. And I think I'm super excited that it's collaborating together, because it's going to make a complete system because I have a recovery housing that has wraparound services. So not only do I have the resident stuff, but I also have case management to go in there and to keep track of that recovery capital and all that is just super exciting. So, and they make the process really easy, you guys.
Thank you.
So just to clarify, you're saying that there's going to be a learning management system on ARMS eventually?
Yeah, actually this month. So by the end of this month, it's going to be released within
Okay.
5-6 days.
Okay, and in the meantime, reach out to Michael Hardy if we have any questions.
Yeah.
Because some of the onboarding was missed for some of our staff, and so the mapping gets a little confusing and so on and so forth. So
Yeah, absolutely, Thomas. If you connect with Michael, and Michael can always pull one of either us to the Get Help support team into. So he is your point of contact, and he'll pull the right people in to be able to associate either in Zoom. We can do Zoom trainings too, which is what we've done up through today. And we did recently with Julia too, who's coming on board. So we'll continue to do that. Absolutely.
thank you.
Michael, if you want to, oh, yeah, you're going to say something.
Yeah, and you can call me or email me, and we can set up a Zoom if that's necessary. And one of the great things about doing this with Zoom is I can walk you through exactly, you can do it, and I can talk you through that. And if there's something that's over my head, then Jessica or one of the Get Help team are very helpful in responding to me.
Okay, we are very excited, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Sorry, we are a bit late and rushing upstairs from a talk that we just did downstairs, and I'm looking forward to seeing each of you either online or moving forward again in the future. I'm sure you can coordinate with Brianna and Michael on how to get started, and looking forward to welcoming you all into the RETCAP community.
Thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you. And I'll go ahead and send the video as resources for you guys as well. And again, I'll put Michael's email. Oh, Michael put his email in the chat, and he's our navigator for Walker. And again, any more questions, feel free to reach out to me or Michael. We'll direct you to where we need to be. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Brianna.
Yeah.